Right. Hello, world. Hello, darlings. This is a bedtime story for all of... Sorry, red light in my camera. This is a bedtime story for all you little kits and cats and kittens and whatnot out there. That would be you. Yes, you. I know who you are. Just kidding, no I don't. Right. This is a bedtime story, so get your cookies and milk. Sit back and relax. This is a story entitled River. Once there was a palace far, far away. In this palace lived a prince that never saw a person. He was very lonely, because there was never anyone to talk to. Yes, there were many servants, but they couldn't be spoken to, because they knew nothing of what it was like to be royalty. They knew nothing of having to settle disputes or being forced to make laws of the land. Being an arbitrator is a very difficult job, and the prince was tired of life, even though he was very young. His name was River. He was only 15, but he had the full weight of the monarchy on his hands, or so it felt. Every day people would come in and speak before him. They would complain and raise charges against one another. As hard as he tried, the people would always return to him with more complaints. Sometimes they had new things to complain about. Sometimes they had new problems to be solved. But that was rare. Most of the time they simply rehashed the same problems they had before. The prince found it very tiresome, but it was also rewarding most of the time. He would often attempt to find the underlying cause of all the disturbances, especially if there were just a few people who brought him the most problems. But every time he tried, they would insist that there was nothing, or that it was someone else's fault. One day, River grew very tired of his life. He was bored and he was very sad watching people come in with problems. He hated seeing people upset, so he decided that he would leave his castle. He would leave his palace and walk among the people, see what they saw, and maybe, with some luck, feel as they felt. So he went to his chambers and found the most peasantish clothes he could. They were still very nice and very elegant, but not suited for palace life. Dressed as such, he made his way out of the castle and into the streets. He wandered alone and cold for many hours before the sun came up. After his long night, he wanted to sleep. But the instant he found a soft-looking pile of garbage, he saw an old woman. She was lying on the ground moaning. He made his way over to her. He was scared. He had never seen anybody in so much physical pain before. He knelt beside her and asked her what was wrong. She answered simply that she was dying. He did not know the meaning of the word. He asked her to explain, in hopes that he could help. She simply laughed and told him not to worry, because there were people with far worse problems. They had to live. She died laughing, a smile on her face. River was unsure what to make of the old woman, and still not knowing what death was, he carried her with him. He carried the old woman on his back until it was time for lunch, or as near as he could figure. He set her down. When he sat down, he could hear the sounds of two maidens arguing. He told the old woman to wait just a moment. He would be back. River climbed over a small hill and found two maidens that he recognized. They had come seeking his help many times. They claimed to be best friends, but they never stopped fighting or thinking of themselves. He walked towards them. They seemed to need his help. As he approached, they stopped fighting long enough to tell him how the other one was in the wrong. River couldn't help but wince. It was clear that neither one of them was right, and they were both wrong. They would never be able to settle their argument. Not only would they not listen to each other, they wouldn't listen to themselves. They pleaded with him to tell them which person was right, and they yelled at him and cursed him when he told them they were wrong. Finally, when he told them that he couldn't help, they wouldn't listen long enough to find out why. He climbed back over the hill after many hours. He sat and started talking to the old woman, who seemed to have eaten well during the day. After a long time, he finally asked her again what it meant to die, but she wouldn't answer. After a long time of thought, he decided that dying meant to stop caring. just relax. So he curled next to the old woman for the night and died. In the morning he woke up, but he couldn't make the old woman stand. Even when he stood her on her head, she would not stand for herself. He told her that if they were to get anywhere, that she would have to stop being dead, but she wouldn't listen to his reason. He sighed and hefted her onto his back again and started walking. He passed the two girls on the road. They simply lay there as he walked by. They must have decided to die, he thought to himself. Their deaths left him unfazed, for he still did not understand. He walked for days, trying to help people, but he never seemed capable of helping. Either they wouldn't listen, or they didn't understand, that they caused their own problems. And on the rare occasion that they didn't, there was always a way out. They simply never chose to help themselves. The old woman was beginning to become very plump. She never said a word. River hoped that they would find a place to bathe soon, because she was smelling very bad. Not that he would mention such a thing to an old woman. They soon came to a castle, even grander than any that River had ever seen before. The walls were tall and pure white, the towers were topped with gold, and the roads were paved in silver. River was amazed. It had to be a very powerful and great king that lived here, if he was indeed the king, then he must have been River's father, for he was a prince after all. He and the old woman entered the castle. At first the guards refused to let them in, because they were dressed as peasants. But soon River convinced them to let him in, with his knowledge of the royal matters. He told them about how royals were picked and what colors were best worn on what days, and they were mightily impressed. River thought them all rather silly, because nothing he had said mattered at all. Yet that was what impressed people. He and the old woman made their way to the king's chamber, but they were stopped by his top aide, who explained that the king already knew all their troubles, and was already working to fix them. River was quick to point out that they hadn't spoken of their troubles to the king, or to anyone for that matter. The aide laughed and turned them away, explaining that the king didn't need to be told. River thought that was a very silly reply. And anyway, if he couldn't speak to the king, how was the king to reply? River tried to tell the aide that he was the king's son, but the aide would not listen, insisting the king had only one son, and that River was not that one. River became enraged, because he knew quite well that the king had many children, though he did not know any of them anymore. It had been a very long time since he had seen anyone in his family. He told the aide where to shove it, and stormed out of the castle, with the old woman on his back. Even her washing hadn't gotten rid of the smell. Eventually, River and the old woman came to a forest. It was nearly night, and the forest was very dark. So River decided to make a camp for the night, place the woman under a sturdy tree, where she would be comfortable in her silence, then set off to gather firewood. As he walked, he rehashed his anger, going over every detail in his mind. Finally, he called out to the distant king, in frustration and anger. As he began to retrace his path back to the camp, he found an older man, leaning against the tree. The old man smiled, but River was afraid. The old man assured him that he meant no harm, and River drew closer. The man was dressed in shabby clothes, but his smile was gentle. River asked him where he had come from. The man laughed. He had come from the palace that River had just been to, but he had left long before River had arrived. River asked him if he had known the king. He laughed again. He was the king. He had left when his aides had decided that because he knew everything, it meant people wouldn't have to talk to him. He had left because it was silly. Of course people would have to talk to him, because they needed to be able to hear what he had to say. So he left, and had gone to anyone that had needed his help. River nodded, understanding. But he had to know. Why do people die? He still didn't understand. He also wanted to know why he couldn't die. The king smiled gently, with a great amount of sorrow in his eyes. He explained slowly to River, people die because they have to. It was not a choice they made, and it was not a condition. It was simply part of life. River still didn't understand why people died. Why was it part of what happened? The king shook his noble head. The reasons were varied. Everybody died for a different reason. Some died because they had done what they had needed to do. Others died because they wouldn't do, or they couldn't do, what they wanted. Some died to save others. Some died to accomplish their life's work. River explained what the old woman had said. The king nodded and explained. People hate life because their life is in pain, but they expect death to be without pain. He then continued to explain that they misunderstood life as being either a journey that had to be made, or a set of duties that had to be done. While those were both part of it, most of life was what the person wanted it to be. They could make it about experiences if they wanted. They could make it about duty, or the future. It was really up to them. River nodded, and almost understood. He was so tired. The world seemed so dark. He asked the king to meet the old woman. Perhaps she would speak to him. The king smiled and nodded as he carried the sleeping River back to his own palace, where he would live and rule for a very long time. Whenever someone came to complain, he would start not by asking what the problem was, but what their life was. And when they were ready to leave, he would ask them what their life was going to be. Good night. Sleep well.